Okay. Hello and welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm here to record another video. Um, the other day, I started recording something where I was talking about Venus conjunct Uranus and Taurus before the ingress of both of these planets into Gemini. And of course, Uranus being an outer planet, it's going to be in Gemini for quite a while. So usually when these outer planets switch signs, it's a pretty big deal. And I was focusing, however, more on the proximity of the Venus and Uranus conjunction to the fixed star Algol and talking about how, in my own practice as an astrologer, I have done charts for people with Algol, and there is some kind of association with Algol and a kind of repression or um, the a problem of like negative spirits that are associated with, let's say, destructive habits like addiction and stuff like that. And I used a reference to Twin Peaks and the idea of Garmonbozia, or this Garmonbozia demon, this idea that there are some kind of negative entities that feed off pain and suffering and keep people trapped in some kind of cycle of, um, I don't know, people, there's this idea of being stuck in a toxic cycle that only creates pain and suffering, and that there's some kind of there's the implication of some kind of metaphysical other dimensional being who is intentionally trapped you in these circumstances and is you are like, it's almost like, the Matrix, where you're stuck in some kind of like battery thing, and your own jouissance, your pleasure and pain is really just being uh, leached into some kind of other circuit for some kind of other thing to profit off you or something like that. And this could be yeah, your energy is just biopower for some kind of other thing going on, right? Um, there's there's some kind of issue. There's something I didn't get around to getting into with all of this, and I don't even know how this video is going to play out, because I haven't like written this out as an essay that I'm just reading off a teleprompter or anything like that. I'm going to be attempting to work this out in real time, so bear with me here. But there is some underlying issue around all this stuff that I'd like to get into, and I think a good place to start is to just go over some of the influences I have that influence my way of thinking about this. And first of all, I suppose a big impact on my life was this whole thing about psychiatry and anti-psychiatry. And there is that also kind of dovetails in with the whole thing about addiction and addiction recovery. And one of the things I guess I could say is that if you rewind to this period of time where trying, I was mainly preoccupied with trying to get my ass out of the mental health system and get some kind of agency over, because I mean, it can be a contentious issue, but I am personally choose not to use psychiatric medication. And currently in my life, I have to use some other medications for non-psychiatric health problems, but I'm putting up with that. But I'm kind of, I tend towards this direction of being kind of like, uh, what do you say, natural organic granola kind of approach of not wanting to be completely dependent on pharmaceutical drugs. But sometimes you can't be entirely perfect about this stuff, even if that. And then there's this kind of issue about like how much of a Puritan you want to be about anything. But I did have exposure to this one guy that I knew who was in Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's something about the mentality of being really invested in the perspective of addiction recovery that this guy was also somebody who suffered from like psychotic illness and somebody who was interested in like the esoteric and the occult and all this kind of stuff. And at the time of meeting him, he was much more involved in that kind of stuff than I was. And then eventually, there's this kind of this idea that comes from, I guess you could say, it's not just astrology, but it's like inherent in the addiction recovery scene, and the way that the AA and addiction recovery is often very kind of spiritual, and that you need a higher power to guide you rather than making your own decisions or something like that, right? There's this kind of like idea that like there's this kind of idea, especially with like, I don't know, lunations or like different periods of your life and different transitions from one thing to the other, that there's always this kind of thing of like letting go what no longer serves you, and shedding the old skin, and like stepping into your true authentic self, and all this kind of stuff, which is like, and then like when that comes combined with addiction or whatever, and addiction recovery, I don't know, this is just my impression of dealing with some people like this, is that it often comes to be this situation where you are viewing your life as like some kind of a problem, and that it's kind of like, it's one of those things where it's like, if the only tool you have in the toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of thing, and like your problem is always just basically, I guess, it is the spiritual thing of attachment. Your problem is that you have these attachments to things that you just need to let go of. And then you just need to, like, if you can just let go of things and not be addicted or not be attached, then that's the answer. And that, like, if you get really invested in something like the New Age or the spirituality or the occult, and that doesn't work out for you in terms of giving you the result that you expected or what you were looking for from it, then what you're basically doing is that you're putting all this energy into this thing that just creates pain and suffering and anxiety for you, and that basically, instead of being helpful, you're interested in the New Age or the esoteric, the occult has just become an addiction. And so in order to show that you're not attached, you have to like give up all your books. You have to like renounce, you have to separate contact with everybody in that scene. And you just have to like return yourself to some kind of like neutral position where you're not involved in that kind of stuff. And then you have to like look at all the other things that you put a lot of time and energy to, like if you, let's say, have like a hobby, like, if you're like, oh, when I was a teenager, I was really into rock and roll music, but now all I do is like, I try to write songs and I just get frustrated, and it like, I have all this investment in this thing that's not going anywhere. So I just have to like sell all my records. I have to sell all my musical, and like you're in this like constant like binge purge cycle, where like this alternates between like, eventually you might find something like, oh, maybe I'll try this out, right? And like you're like swinging back and forth between like, I'm a bad person, all the things that I like, all the things that I do don't turn out for me, it just makes me upset and causes pain and suffering, so I have to take this part of me that is just, it's an unhealthy addiction, and I just have to purge that, and then I have to find something else that's to put my energy into, and then just like, because this is coded as being more healthy, then this makes me feel good because I'm making positive changes in my life. I'm de-investing from this thing and reinvesting in this thing. And then if I have people saying supportive things around that, that's encouraging, but then eventually the same pattern plays out and is not giving me what I want, and then I have to just like take this one part of myself that's identified with that, and then just be like, you're only making me cause pain and suffer, and I just have to like kill this part of myself, and then like try to be this person that is going to be socially accepted. So you know what I'm trying to say? It's like there's this, you start to see that this whole cycle of being like, I need to like let go of what no longer serves me and open up to some new possibility to then get excited about, and then it's like, this whole cycle is actually kind of like an addictive cycle, or that and it's like you kind of see these cycles play out in other people, and then to me it has the effect of making me feel somewhat disillusioned by this whole mentality of like, I just have to constantly just be like taking all these parts of me that are not giving me the results I want and just purge them, and in a very like cold and ruthless way, and then like eventually that will free up all this energy for me to become the person that I'm supposed to be, and then the person that I'm supposed to be is going to be like greeted with all this like, you know, all these people just cheering me on, and like you know, everyone's gonna be like, you know, like I'm gonna be a success basically, right? You know, I just have to be really like consistent about this, like purging all the things about myself that I don't like, and then reinvesting the energy into things that I do like, and then I will transform myself into being a better person, right? There's something about this whole mentality where it seems like this is usually what this in the situation of my friend. He was going through a divorce, and it was clearly obvious to me that a lot of this was done for the sake of like, if I'm able to transform myself in the right way, is going to make me into the person who is going to save my failing marriage, and then the fact that I will be able to save my failing marriage will be like the reward for me making all the right decisions, and just prove to me that I've done the right thing and I've become a good person. And then in your failure to actually accomplish that goal, you just hate yourself even more, and then you know, and then you just swing so much harder into the other extreme of just being like, oh, all my attempts to make myself better have been for naught. I might as well just relapse back into all my old bad habits, which you never really got rid of in the first place. They're just waiting to pounce back, and then you're just caught in this vicious cycle that never ends, basically, right? And it's not because, like, the whole thing is because you're not really doing it out of a spirit of non-attachment. You're doing it into a spirit of, like, very much doing this to be like, how do I create the version of myself that gives me the end result that I want, which is basically a secure attachment, which is actually the complete opposite of being completely unattached and free, right? Like, you're not doing, if you go into this whole process with the attitude of like, if I do everything right, it's going to be what people approve of, and this is going to give, and I'm going to be rewarded and get all the things I want. That's basically being attached to an outcome and being attached to a system of conditioning, and it's the opposite of having a kind of spirit of liberation and freedom, basically, right? But then, you know, there's a starting point anyways, right? That whole thing, right? And basically moving on from that, there's other influences that, you know, eventually I, in my own, you know, just pursuing things that interested me, I ended up getting involved with an esoteric group and just checking it out for myself. And it was a different style of esoteric group than the kind that my friend was involved in. So I haven't really like done this whole like, there's a couple of different styles of spirituality that I've been involved with. And for the longest time in the early days, it was more kind of like this sort of like, Neo Advaita Zen kind of Eckhart Tolle, you know, that kind of approach to things. And what I noticed was that, like, I was doing a lot of that with a teacher that I met, and I was finding it to be helpful. But my friend in that position, for some reason, even though he had to renounce and like let go, or like he had to, the stuff that he was involved in, he just figured was making him crazy, and he had to like give up all his books and renounce it all or whatever. And then like there's something kind of thing where you're like, Eckhart Tolle is not, people who are really serious into the esoteric and the occult and all this kind of stuff tend to have this, you know, they have a bit of a superiority thing going on. Like, they only go for the really respectable kind of, like, you know, the things that people take seriously, and like some new age self-help book writer who ends up on Oprah is not cool, basically, right? So there's like, so I don't know, where maybe I'm getting a bit distracted here. Eventually, anyways, I end up making friends with some people on the internet that are into like Gurdjieff stuff, and I end up doing a bit of in the middle of the pandemic, I get pulled into this Gurdjieff group or whatever. And the thing I had to admit about this is that leading up to this, or part of my experience in the Gurdjieff group had to do with me reading material on my own, and then comparing what I was getting from reading I basically started before, even before I joined the group, I started reading this book called Meetings with Remarkable Men, and there is a movie that was made after Meetings with Remarkable Men that I think you can just watch for free on YouTube. But I have to admit that the book is way better, and it's rather than, there's a certain influence of like all this that you have to take into consideration the fact that the time period in which Gurdjieff was alive was like, he was alive through like the end of the Victorian era through the war period of World War I and World War II, and lived through that whole transition into like the beginning of what we would call modernity as we know it, right? If you can imagine going from this like prior to World War I, 19th century, late Victorian era kind of thing, and then living through that massive technological acceleration with all these changes and stuff like that. And he was the kind of guy that apparently Blavatsky thought he was going to be like the teacher for the new age, right? There's something about all this. There's some kind of thing which I feel like it seems he was also a contemporary of Aleister Crowley, and there seemed one of the things that I would advise perhaps is like, if you do find yourself in a Gurdjieff group, do not bring up Aleister Crowley, because it seems to just like set off like this kind of resentment, or I don't know what it is, but there's some kind of thing like there seems to be some sort of conflict between the Gurdjieffians and the Crowleyans, and that there's a kind of hostility in that anybody takes Crowley seriously at all, and that anything that's associated as being cool about Crowley has to be like, is actually, he was just ripping, or like Gurdjieff is actually the dude, right? And so there's this kind of like, in this sort of attitude, part of what seems to set Gurdjieff, like there's conflict between Gurdjieff and Crowley, is that Crowley seemed to initially really rebel against a lot of these like prudish or puritanical kind of Victorian attitudes. And then in contrast, it seems like it's kind of confusing, because it seems like Gurdjieff is simultaneously very like there's this kind of Victorian prudishness, but then there's a kind of transcending beyond that, and then getting it, but like it could also just be like the dealing with the problem of the historical position that you are in, and that, whether that is to deal with, if you imagine if you're in that position around, you're like being a spiritual teacher at the time when you've got the influences of people like Sigmund Freud, Friedrich Nietzsche, this whole attitude of repression. Meanwhile, you've got all this spiritualism movement going on. Like, this is just the culture that you're dealing with, right? And there's something about like the issue around that the New Age movement at that point in time, and what kind of vision or expectation people had for the New Age movement. They basically thought that there's a new era of science opening up, and that the spiritualists thought that there ought to be you didn't have to draw some like hard line between spirituality and science, and that, let's say, if there were such things as, let's say, ghosts or whatever, that there, in the same way that you could detect things like, I don't know, like X-rays or like radio magnetic, like there's all sorts of the spectrum of what humans sense. Like light exists on a certain bandwidth of radiation spectrum, but there's like ultraviolet light, or like infrared, and there's all sorts of different particles and waves out there that we need scientific equipment to pick up. People thought that like, as we get better with this, we'll have a scientific understanding of the paranormal and the supernatural, and you don't have to the New Age will somehow integrate all this together, right? And if you go more into like the I did make some videos about Ken Wilber, and I think Ken Wilber is maybe also the spirit of trying to be like, we don't have to create a boundary between New Age spiritual stuff and scientific, understanding, that we can integrate them together. And there's still this basic spirit of not creating that hard line or drawing that division between these two things. But you also have to understand that in this, there's been there are certain kinds of attitudes that seem kind of old-fashioned, that still seem to like be stubbornly dominate the era of science, or create this separation between what's considered scientific or what is considered to be kind of like New Age spiritual stuff. And for example, you could use the word holistic, right? Like versus allopathic, right? And the problem with the allopathic perspective is that it tends to be all about trying to like hone in on this very specifics of the problem and isolate the problem down to one thing that's malfunctioning that you can either remove or you can like medicate or something like that, but not look at that part that is problematic in the context of the whole situation and to understand. So it's like the kind of thing that like if you are like if you just have to like hone in on these like really specific things, like it's not the stress of like like if you're under a lot, like the kind of thing, like let's say you have some sort of health problem, like high blood pressure, or like you're under stress and anxiety and all this kind of stuff, that like they want to like zoom in and be like, oh, you just have this one chemical and we just need to tweak this one chemical, or you have your hormones are a little bit off and stuff like that. It's not because people are threatening World War III and or like you're getting fired from your job, or that you're all these other like I mean, this should just be kind of like obvious, I think, right? There's all these social things going on, but they zoom in on this one part and just be like, oh, it's because you have a substance addiction and all this. And it like there's also this whole thing about like understanding whatever, like I don't know, like I feel a lot of the time you look and you take that and this kind of what I'm trying to say about this, and then apply that to this whole dynamic of like you have to take what it, let go of what no longer serves you, and constantly go through this process of purifying yourself and all this kind of stuff. And it tends to be just like not, it's like there's still this conflict of like there are just these like little things that I have to like, if I just purge these little stubborn parts of myself, then I'll free up all this energy that I can just binge out on something that will be socially approved of, and that will like solve all my problems for me. And then meanwhile, not really understanding that it's just like another kind of attachment, or that people, like even if you're like, oh, I'm gonna, instead of being an alcoholic, I'm just gonna like be I'm gonna hustle my career, and not see that, okay, maybe being fanatic about your career is also just a kind of form of compulsive addiction, and that you're like, it's now addicted to like approval seeking, and you're just kind of like, I'm just gonna be like, really, I'm just gonna lock in on my social media, and I'm gonna just dedicate myself to finding what works, and I'm gonna impress people, and then they're gonna like, encourage me to be a better person. And it's like, you're still just like, you're still addicted to this like weird attachment thing, and you're not becoming free and unattached, right? But there's this idea that like there's also this idea in all of this that, to get right down to it, there's some kind of issue where I have basically decided not to. Well, I don't know. It's kind of funny because again, there's an issue about my own investigation into the Gurdjieff teachings and reading the books versus my experience in the Gurdjieff group. And what happened was that we're not really doing the Gurdjieff group anymore, because the group has tended to shift in this other direction, which is just kind of more of a general kind of a new age group, and I'm not really that interested in it. And like part of the issue was that like a lot of the things that I would be reading on my own about Gurdjieff versus the way that the people in the supposed Gurdjieff group went about things seem to be in some kind of direct contradiction to each other. And I don't know, instead of seeing this as being inherently problematic, I just kind of took it as a kind of a quirk. But that there's some kind of thing where you're like, it's a kind of like a catch-22 where you're dependent on this group to be like, this is my authentic connection to the tradition. And yet when I go to the source material and when I compare that to what these people are doing and the approach they're taking, it doesn't like, it seems more like you can kind of just be like, okay, there's also the question of like, do we need to keep the original teaching in some sort of like pure form, or is it okay to just like use that as inspiration and mix it up with a bunch of other new age stuff? Or they're like, what, and then in the context of all this too, there's the difference between working with that group or reading the material, and then just what tends to proliferate in general as like the New Age movement online. And the New Age movement, like the New Age movement online, tends to go in this direction that's like, you know, like certain ideas predominate with chakras and raising your vibration and manifesting things and all this kind of stuff. And I do at least appreciate the idea of having a closed group or a, you know, something that's not just like public, where you can do, and then you can set something up where you are like, this is what tends to proliferate just in general. And like what we are doing is something that is just not that. You know, and then to be so that we can see when there's all these people that are like, because this is issue about the problem about the New Age metaphysical scene versus like, I have this kind of, there's dealing with it at this one level, the New Age, whether you want to call it metaphysical or whatever, versus another kind of influence that I have would be, let's say, like philosophy and critical theory and stuff like that. And there tends to be this dichotomy that's created. And one thing that I always remember is like a meme. I don't know. This is one of the funny things too, is that I probably saved the meme, but I don't, it's probably too disorganized to find it. But it was like this meme that was like showing a bunch of dogs, and like they had this idea of like, you have these like manly dogs that people take seriously, that would be like Dobermans and like you know, Rottweilers and big tough guard dogs that are really like, and it would say it's like Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and it's like the big guys of you know, German philosophy, right, or like continental philosophy. These are like the man's philosophers, the man's thinkers, and then it shows like these like really like tiny little like toy poodles, and these like being like, it's like Blavatsky, Gurdjieff, Eckhart Tolle, you know, like, and it, like this is kind of like the attitude that like, if you're in this kind of like, you're in this kind of philosophy bro atmosphere, it's like that there's this whole, and this is what I noticed from like dealing with my friend who is like into like esoteric and occult stuff, is that there's a certain thing that's like, what you're going for your source of this stuff is like, there's a certain thing where like, if you're really sophisticated, then you're taken seriously and you can like show off and have this like air of superiority. Whereas if you like go for like the thing your mom listens to for Eckhart Tolle or something, like you're kind of lame, right? But it doesn't seem, this seems to be more about like creating this sort of like image of being impressive, rather than like if there is a transcendent truth, do you think that, what do you think is more important, like a transcendent truth, or like whatever you think you're gonna impress your friends with, right? Like, and if you're attached to impressing your friends, like maybe that is like an attachment rather than like your unbiased like search for truth or something, right? So there's this kind of issue here with in this, where there's this like, there is this thing, however, with when it comes to the problem with metaphysics about like, can you make positivist claims about metaphysics, right? And I ended up taking a philosophy course that was basically all about just like solving this kind of problem, because philosophy has kind of gotten itself a bad reputation for being overly kind of reductive, in the sense that, or being overly skeptical, and that there's all these things that you can't make positive claims over, because we can't, like, if we're talking about, just for example, if you're like a metaphysical person and you're into something, let's say like the Kabbalah or like the Neoplatonic chain of being or whatever it is, like these are things that we can like these models that we can like imagine and visualize and talk about and stuff. But then you're like, okay, well, how do you say that that's actually a real thing that exists rather than something that you're just coming up with in your mind? Like, how do you say, like, and then with this very, it's kind of in that kind of spirit of skeptical philosophy, it's created a kind of a bad reputation in the sense that you've got people who are like, like the easiest way I talk about it is basically just the fact that we, in the normal everyday experience of reality, everybody can agree that the sky is blue and that the grass is green. But then what if you say that, oh, well, just because you're a human being, your senses experience the environment like that. What if an animal interpreted those signals in a different way? What then? And like, how then that they take that to some kind of extreme where it's like, oh, well, maybe nothing's real at all. Maybe we can't say anything about anything, and maybe we don't know anything, right? And there's this kind of there's also this whole style of like Zen spirituality, which tries to just be like, yes, exactly. We can't say anything about anything, so all we can do is just shut up and just meditate and not talk about anything and leave it at that. And it becomes this sort of and then you try to say anything and you're just like shut down, basically, right? And that I'm not gonna get stuck in that one right now, but there's some basic issue in all this where the consensus, anyways, it creates this whole thing where you've got all these like new age metaphysical people that will just like spurt something that sounds like a bunch of jargon or a bunch of gibberish and make these like positive claims that are just like about how things work, and then you don't really have anything to back it up, but just being like, I intuited it, or I channeled this information from who knows where, and you just have to take my word that I will just make these positive claims, and then you just have to like accept them for what they are. And that if I have a bunch of people around me who say that I am like some sort of master and I'm a channeler, then you just have to accept everything I say without questioning it. With this kind of like cult, like, everything I say is just going to be the truth because all these people are around to confirm that. And like, we just have this massive like cult, like following to this one way of doing things that has to go completely unquestioned. Right. Which is like, I think it should be kind of fairly obvious that like that's kind of a sketchy way to approach things, and that it is, I was raised more with a spirit that like, we live in a rational society that's governed by the principle of reason, and that anything's open for discussion and anything's open for debate and analysis. And rather than just this sort of like, you just have to accept that this one person has some sort of access to some sort of truth that you don't, and you just have to shut up and then listen to everything this other person says and then be obedient to them. And that if you can't do that, that means you're a sinner or a bad person that will get kicked out, basically, right? Like, and so there's this kind of this is kind of like in that whole kind of attitude, you can kind of imagine, like, I tend to want to have the ability to reason things out myself and not just be some person who is dictated to what they should or what they shouldn't think, what ideas are okay or what ideas are not okay, all that kind of stuff. But I feel like, okay, I don't know if I'm maybe getting off track of this, because there's some kind of idea that I want to hone in on about addiction, or about the idea of specifically, there's one issue again between working, like, I don't think in any of the Gurdjieff stuff that I read specifically was there any talk about the idea of parasites or entities that, like, this whole idea that there's like, if you have an addiction, there's some kind of parasitical entity that is feeding off your pain and suffering and all this kind of stuff. And there's also this kind of irony about about like comparing, well, I don't want to get I don't want to like get into any personal critique of anyone's bad habits or anything like that. But if you look at just Gurdjieff as a teacher himself, the guy, the only video footage that we have of this guy is him smoking a cigarette, right? And that apparently Gurdjieff and Blavatsky smoked like chimneys because back in those days they didn't have the same awareness of like how much smoking was detrimental to your health in terms of causing lung cancer and all this kind of stuff. And so it's like, it's kind of, to me, it's kind of funny because it's like, it seems out of place to use this sort of idea of like a demon that is feeding off of your addictions and all this kind of stuff when you're like chain smoking like a chimney or whatever, right? Like, it's like, wouldn't that be like, I mean, you could say that you are literally, this bad habit is literally producing this thing like a cancerous growth in your body, and if you were to stop this, you wouldn't be giving yourself cancer, kind of thing, right? But like, and then like, so if that's not so like there's this kind of Victorian prudishness where it's not like smoking cigarettes is fine, but if you are like a fornicator or a masturbator, if you touch yourself, you're dirty. Like, there's this kind of Victorian attitude where apparently there's this kind of great one of the things I like to listen to is like Gary Lachman has a series of talks that he does where Gary Lachman talks about Aleister Crowley and Gary Lachman talks about Blavatsky. And it's funny because it's like, I don't know if I can still find the links to them. Maybe I'll put them in the description, but the Gary Lachman videos, he's just like, he ends up roasting Blavatsky pretty hard in the fact that she's like, you're going to be somebody who's like really like, there's this weird kind of, but the thing is, you have to accept that nobody's perfect, right? And that everybody has their flaws and problems. And that I think there's also maybe an issue of like trying to expect a spiritual teacher to be like totally perfect or something like that. But if you've got like a bunch of people who might be like, have this really Victorian era kind of spirituality that's really uptight about sex stuff, but then you are grossly overweight and smoking like a chimney and being like, there's this one bad habit that I'm going to focus on and being really, really puritanical about. And then there's other bad habits where it's like, well, you know what? You win some, you lose some. I have managed to make myself I've purified my astral body of all my imperfections. And, if I want to have a cigarette, you can lay the fuck off. Okay. It's like, this is like, I'm just noticing that this tends to be, even if you're not into like the new age like that, I've noticed that it tends to be like this thing where people have certain issues that they hyper fixate on and being like, if I take this one, like in an allopathic approach, if I take this one thing that I judge about myself as being a problem and then try to be like really, really, really puritanical about that, then that is going to be the thing that if I make any progress in that, it's going to just like solve the problem of my life and I'll be a success. And then if I fail, I'll fail, right? And then, but meanwhile, as I'm so focused on solving this one problem, that just gives me the excuse that there's other problems that, nobody cares if I smoke cigarettes, or nobody cares if I do this, nobody cares if I do, and it ends up these things where people are like, you're kind of like, why is it that like, there's this weird, like, why do you have to be so puritanical about this thing when if you're so intuitive, you're so visionary, can't you intuit that these other things like instead of just hyper focusing on one thing that you have to be a perfectionist about and then everything else goes out the window, like can't you just maybe like spread it out and even it out a bit more where we can like, what about these other like glaring blind spots that you're not dealing with, and you can relax around this one thing and then maybe address some of the other things, right? But no, or what tends to happen, or at least, I mean, what is that people seem to just like go through cycles where something gets a pass, something doesn't, and you're like, I need to just purge myself of this one thing that's bad while I'm binging out on this other thing. And then you're like, wait a minute, what if this other thing that I'm binging out on is also an unhealthy addiction? I'm gonna purge that one now, and then like, you go through this like revolving cycle of like there's some like you're gonna be like hyper focusing on one thing as like, if I solve this problem, it's going to make my life better, and then meanwhile there's all these other problems that, like, if anybody calls you out on, you'll just freak out at. Right? I don't know. So there's this anyways, there's something about this too, which is like I have to admit that I have a certain, everybody has attachments. I have to admit that I have a certain attachment to collecting synthesizer stuff, and that there is a certain, there are certain highs and lows of collecting synthesizer. But I could take what I'm trying to say is that my same friend who was into constantly binging or purging himself of his new age associations and new age books and all this kind of stuff. There's also would also talk about collecting Eurorack stuff as an addiction, as Eurocrack, right? Or this idea that it does create this I have to admit there's a certain kind of excitement where it's if I buy something and I haven't bought something in a while and I'm all excited about it, and then I'm you're riding the rush of oh, I'm gonna play with this new thing and see, and then a little bit consumeristic and a little bit materialistic, and then just be like, wait a minute, I'm focusing all my energy into doing this one thing that isn't taking me where I want to go in life, and this thing is you could, rather than making it about an unhealthy cult group or something, or a trying to recover out of alcoholism or something like that, you could just have a hobby, and then just be instead of what I don't also understand is that for some reason there's certain hobbies that are always coded in a way as being positive, and hobbies that are coded as in a way that's negative. I mean, I don't really understand why these value judgments exist. There's something about, for some reason, living with my family, my mother and my sister, are there's something, or exactly male coded hobbies, female coded hobbies. And I knew when I was in high school, I knew guys who learned how to knit and would knit a toque or something, right? So it is even if you go beyond the gender binary and do a female coded hobby like knitting, of course guys can do that, right? But for some reason, living with my mother and my sister, they're always putting there's always this pressure, you want to why don't you take up knitting, Dan? It's such a fun hobby, and we're gonna just spend there's all these other things you could be putting your energy into, but we're gonna spend all day just knitting blankets, and we've already got a dozen blankets, but we're just gonna knit because for some reason knitting is just coded as this good thing. If you knit, you're a good person and you're doing something good, and everybody likes it when you knit stuff. And then it's sort of but if you want to collect Eurorack modules, it's this is a parasitic entity that's sucking my life force away, that's making me hate myself, because and it's why is one thing coded as being positive and one thing coded as negative, and isn't this just a kind of a value judgment based on your position in this whole kind of system, right? That is perhaps relative. If you were there's some, or why, there's some kind of thing where there's all these other things that I could be doing with my time and energy, and it's sort of it seems I don't also know that there's this if it's just a pressure to conform to whatever is in your environment, regardless of whether that is, whether that's your mom and your sister knitting, or whether that's some guy who has, different standards for lawn care, or or it could also be things the pressure to become a parent or not, right? Why is it just you're oh, well, what you really ought to be doing with your life is producing lots of babies, right? And if you have any sort of thing that you're interested in, a passion or a hobby, and this hobby does not seem to be leading you in a direction where you're just reproducing and having lots of children, then this is, you're put here on earth not to indulge in your own enjoyment, your own selfish pleasure. You're here to selfishly sacrifice your own interests for the sake of raising children, right? Now, I mean, maybe some people, I have to admit that I think part of the issue that I've had with not feeling like I want to collaborate or deal with astrologers is that a lot of what astrology seems to be doing, from my perspective, is people who are adults, who are parents, making, like, if you're transitioning from one part of your life into another part of your life, you can say like, oh, wow, okay, when I was at one part of my life, I had all these things that I like to do that went with that life that I had when I was that person. And now I'm transitioning into another part of my life. And so I can use astrology to see the time up, how these changes happen. And if I take an attitude of non-attachment, then I will smoothly transition from one phase of my life into another phase of life. But the thing is, like, when it comes to that, I mean, it starts like there's this weird thing that I experienced when I was had at one point in time. This is basically it. Like, I took a year-long astrology course to get my certification to do natal charts, and then from that I had met some astrologers who were giving me opportunities to collaborate, and who were trying to, like, help, very kindly help me out and promote me, and like something about like me trying to collaborate with other astrologers, that there's some kind of unconscious energy where, like, I'm trying to, like, I'm trying to inhabit this one kind of mode of consciousness, and I felt like there's unconscious, unresolved things that were just triggered by all this, and that, like, part of it was this dynamic of like you have to, like, basically, this whole process is basically like assumes that you are in somebody who's becoming a parent, and that you have to, like, let go of all the stuff from your past that is not conducive. Like, and I have to admit, for all the parents out there who are taking the responsibility to be a good parent and to raise the next generation to be good people, like, I applaud your efforts, and I'm entirely behind you. I'm not, like, there's this extreme fringe of people called anti-natalists who think that even, like, it's like taking like extreme polarity to the opposite thing to be like, oh, human beings are evil and we're destroying the planet and the human race, there's no good in it, and all this kind of stuff. I'm not one of those people. If you want to have kids and you want to focus on being a good parent, there's obviously nothing wrong with that. But there's this kind of thing that it just, to me, it constantly feels like this force that is just trying to, like, anything that makes my life something that I enjoy or that I appreciate or have fun, and making it, like, I have to be like, forget about what you like. You have to figure out what you're going to do. Like, how do you produce a whole bunch of little children and raise them up to be good people, right? Like, but what if I don't want to do that? What if I don't, like, what if I'm, like, I come from a family where basically, apparently everybody's mentally ill, right? Like, apparently all my ancestors are a bunch of crazy mentally ill people, and all my current family are a bunch of crazy mentally ill people, and I come from a long line of, like, non-functional like crazy people, and I'm just gonna have to, like, the answer to this is to, like, for me to self-sacrifice all the things that I enjoy doing in life, so I can have these little kids that I just resent because, like, I've been pressured in, like, and then you can you see this? You're like, oh, everybody says this is supposed to be the thing that I'm supposed to do, and I resent it because you're taking my capacity away to make my own choices, and, like, I have to fit in with all these, like, astrologers who are just like, oh, if you're just, you have to, like, like, it's not just one astrologer, but it's also trying to socialize in that scene. Like, everybody is, like, for their version of alchemy is, like, you just have to, like, there's all this stuff that you do, but you have to purify yourself, purge all this stuff from you, so you're just this one thing, which is basically conforming to this really, I don't know, it seems stupid to me, basically, right? And I also have to admit, so in all this dynamic, it basically, all this stuff created a situation where I was kind of turned off from the astrology scene, kind of turned off from the New Age scene, and I was interested, I ended up just focusing more on philosophy and critical theory and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, even these kind of New Agers might even see it like that. Like, you're like, oh, instead of you making the choices that you're going to live a happy life, you're just going to read a bunch of books, think too much, get upset, and then your whole philosophical pursuit is basically creating a Garmonbozia, like a demon, right? You're like, instead of you doing productive things with your life, you're just going to sit there reading, producing these ideas that are just going to, cause conflict with you and the people around you, right? You're instead of being a person who fits into society, who knows how to adapt themselves to their community and thrive in that environment, you are instead taking a bunch of fringe philosophical literature that is giving you these ideas that are increasingly more abstract and alienated, and giving you a sense of superiority, where you, instead of being able to better fit in with society, you are now even more alienated, and you're not only that, but you're also hostile, because now you take the other people as being, so this is like, so you're now, taking your mind as being a friendly servant to the world around you, and you've weaponized it with a kind of critical hostility to everyone around you, right? And so that, like, this is kind of like, I think, like, this is kind of like how they relate to the whole philosophical pursuit, right? But with that is kind of, I don't know, maybe kind of the point, because I do want to have a critical capacity, so I'm not just blindly falling into dumb conformity so if I can choose what thing I want to invest my time and energy in, what ideas to follow, I can at least take my own responsibility to be critical about it, right? And not just be a blind follower, right? With that in mind, there's something about all this. I don't think I've concluded yet. I think because the main issue, I think, comes down to the use of rhetoric and language and stuff like that, and specifically in trying to talk about all these problems, the use of the word parasite, right? The idea, and this idea that you could, and the spirit that this comes from is that, like, you could look at the thing, or attachments in life in a like, this could be all kinds of attachments, whether this is emotional attachments, or whether, like, I like to read a certain kind of books. If I like a certain kind of philosopher, I have an intellectual attachment, right? Or like having attachment to your living circumstance being a certain way, or being attached to a certain social arrangement or something like that. There are all kinds of attachments, right? And if we sentimentalize these attachments, we encourage that these are things that we want to support and that we want to flourish and thrive and stuff like that. But if we don't sentimentalize these attachments, there's something about it that's kind of grotesque in a way, because it's the same thing of, like, if you think about owning a bunch of pets, right? That you could, like, think, like, if you could be a person that has a bunch of cats, and you could, like, focus on the positive of, like, oh, I love my cats, they're what a bunch of, they keep me company, what a bunch of friends. And then you could also just be like, well, wait a minute, what if what I want in life isn't cats, it's something else? And that, what if these cats don't actually love me in the way that a person would, that they're really just dependent on me to feed them, and they really just kind of like suck up to me to, like, get me to, and it's like you keeping a bunch of pets prisoner where they don't have any other choice but to suck up and be nice to you, and then you calling that, love and attention, is not really the same thing as having, like, a mature relationship with a human being who gets to decide to be your friend out of their own free will. And that that not only, like, there's this kind of thing about, like, if you were to die in your house, would the cat eat your eyeballs, right? Or like does the cat even care? Like, does the cat just see you as something that feeds them, and if you die, they would just eat you? Or like that kind of position of us looking at everything in a very unsentimental way, and it's just being like, why am I if you have to, like, invest all your time to support all this stuff that is really just, like, not, it's like, it's not really the best way you want to live your life. Like maybe you put it like that. Like, but it's also kind of cruel though, because then if you go too far in that direction, then like everything that like tends to give us comfort, like, you know, like, or you could have like sentimental memories of like, you know, when you were a child in your hometown, and just be like, oh, that's just you being, you know, you have some unresolved trauma that is just keeping you locked into your past, and like you just have to be, you know, if you were completely non-attached, you would have no, you know, you don't need any connection to your local environment. You would just, you know, you could just blast off to outer space. Like there's some kind of like, there's this idea too about if you factor this in with what I'm saying, you know, I can even bring in the Uranus thing here, bring it back to astrology, that like the whole drive to be like, we're going to leave planet Earth behind and go into outer space. It's like, could you imagine like all the sentimental attachment that we have to our own planet versus going into like such a hostile and foreign environment as like to go to Mars, where there isn't any of the plants or animals, or even like it's like incredibly cold, and it's just this strange, distant, barren place that's completely devoid of anything which makes life like worth living, right? Like if you take the more extreme that you take this kind of approach of being like, I'm just going to be complete, like it's kind of like you could, like Gurdjieff is kind of interesting about this too, because he talks like there's this kind of where you can the Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson is almost like a science fiction story, and there is this sort of question about like, if you concretize transcendence in that instead of transcendence being like going to heaven versus on Earth, if it's literally just going into outer space, then it's like, oh, I have to be unattached to all the things that are here on planet Earth that make planet Earth a habitable home environment for me, and abstract myself into this weird thing that has no connection to its history or its ancestors or its origins, and just be this transcendent thing that goes off to Mars in the cold vacuum of howling terror of outer space. You know, and it's like wait a minute, maybe it's good to have a bit of a like attachments of, you know, the you know, what makes your human body healthy and all this kind of stuff. And it's like there's this kind of thing of like but if you view everything that grows and flourishes on Earth as a parasite, and you're like I'm just like this it's like having the mentality that I'm like this abstract Lysol thing that just like everything on Earth is just a bunch of germs that I need to exterminate, and being like, you know, it's like, it's the same attitude of like, you know, like I have to admit, antibiotics, when science discovered antibiotics, prior to that discovery, if you developed just a really minor infection, it could be serious. It could be fatal, right? And because we discovered antibiotics, it revolutionized healthcare, right? But then there's the other. So in that atmosphere where people like, can you imagine that we have just made this discovery? We've just made that advancement. There's this weird like antibiotic approach to everything, where it's like you have to isolate. Your body is full of well, this is also even before I ended up in the Gurdjieff group. I had some contact in the spiritual emergence community with this guy who is a theosophist, and the theosophist guy was really like this too. It's like that it's really important, like from the New Age perspective, it's really important to identify like you may have parasites. You may be full of all kinds of worms and bugs and strange creatures, and that you have to become aware of these one by one and purge them off and purify them, or else you're becoming victim. You're becoming taken over by this strange, hostile alien force, right? And it's like it's kind of old-fashioned, because I think it comes out of that, like the theosophists, in that like we're going to integrate spirituality with science, and like what's coming out of science? It's like we've just discovered penicillin. Wow, what an inspiring discovery. Maybe we can use this discovery of antibiotics to inform our spirituality, and so we can be more aware of how we have to purge off all these microorganisms that aren't good for. And then now we're in this place where you're like, oh, wait a minute. Have you guys heard about the gut biome? Or like, and there's this. What's odd about this to me too is that in the actual dealing with the people, they seem to have this like idea where they do actually understand why you need to have a healthy gut biome, or that there's this idea that when it comes to like, apparently more serotonin is produced in the gut than the brain. Like your gut has more serotonin in it than your brain. and that your mental health may have more to do with your gut health than some brain chemical, and that there's like there's all this thing about like eating fermented foods and yogurts or like probiotic cultures and stuff like that, but instead mainstream science, like, they still just like this thing about like, we're going to isolate the problem. Like, we're going to find the virus, we're going to find the bug, and we're going to kill it. Right. And then we're going to just like, we're going to have this like, it's the same thing too, I think, as like, it's all, I feel like it comes into addiction recovery too, right? Where you're like, you can be like, there's this one thing that I do that's shameful and dirty and bad and horrible, and I have to take this part of me and kill it, and then, but meanwhile, just smoke a whole bunch of cigarettes, right? And then you're like, oh, sorry, we're in the Victorian era, we didn't know any better, right? Like, we do have this intuitive faculty that we can go so far beyond our little egos that we can get signals from the ancient Egyptians and the aliens and all this kind of stuff, but they don't seem to, they don't, like, I didn't know that smoking caused cancer, you know, and don't, you know, and like, there's one part of me that's really bad, but the smoking part, you know, everybody smokes, it's fine, right? Like, it's just like, it's, to me, it seems like obviously kind of moronic, right? And yet, but I think there could be some, you could salvage perhaps some kind of truth from all this, in that maybe there are, like, maybe my life is defined by these things that just bother me, that just like don't change, that don't go away, that I just have to put up with. And that maybe if I wasn't, like maybe those things are like, imagine if you're running a computer and you have like too many tabs open, or you have too much, like, you ended up downloading a bunch of malware programs that are running in the background. Like, it's obviously, if you do have things that are legitimately just a bunch of malware software in the background that's slowing you down, that's wasting your energy, then you'll be much more efficient if you didn't have that happening, right? And so there could be all these like, there could be, my productive capacity is wasted because there's all these things that I'm just resisting, but it's not really. Maybe that's what life is like. Maybe what life is like is that there's going to be all sorts of things that you just have to resist, that are just, you're going to have your energy wasted on resisting things that you don't have any control or agency over, or that when it comes to what you do have control or agency over, you know, it may be so little that you have to find weird hobbies like collecting funny synthesizers and making electronic music that maybe no one's going to listen to, because at least that gives you a place where your creative drive can play out. Because otherwise, like, you know, like, there's like, there's stubborn things that you resist are not going to just somehow resolve themselves because you put more energy into challenging them. It may just further inflame it and may further make it worse, right? So I don't know. I think there is, like, maybe at some point in time you do have to make a compromise, and like, or, you know, it's like the language of like copes, right? Oh, instead of solving the problems, we're just coping. We're just like, we're impotent to change our circumstances. We're powerless to have control over our lives. So all our energy is just consumed by these things which are copes, right? And the idea that, like, but just by participating in an industry of copes, the people who profit off them are like the parasites who are sucking our vital life energy. And like, I don't, you know, right? Why can't I change my life and do what I want to do? Why do I have to just cope, right? Why? And like, like, so there's, I don't know, like, there's some sort of, at some level I can kind of see like why, you know, like maybe there's some truth to it, but in another level, it's like, what if all these things that we think that we need to purge and purify are actually more like we have a diversity of like flora in our gut, and it's like we're just in this really backwards Victorian you know, antibiotic approach to life that like is not really up to date with what we understand things actually work, how things actually work. And part of this also goes with this idea of permaculture. And one of the things I have to admit that this is the thing that got me. I have to admit I have mixed feelings on this guy who does the Rune Soup channel, Gordon White and Rune Soup. I am not 100% on board everything he says, but he just enough that I I would say he's worth watching. I do appreciate what he does. But the thing is that what won me over to Rune Soup in the first place was this interesting insight about permaculture, in that and this has to do with the fact that I live in Canada, and a lot of the attitudes, I don't know if it's more on the West Coast and the East Coast, but there is a lot of people in Canada who are very, there's a sense that there's all these invasive species, both plants and animals, that a bunch of dumb European people brought all these foreign plants over and foreign animals that have just disrupted the flow of the ecosystem, the natural balance of the ecosystem. And there's this kind of like settler colonialist guilt, right? That there's some kind of inherent purity, like the Garden of Eden prior to the fall, this kind of religious purity that existed before we settler colonialists got here, and we just messed it all up, right? And what's interesting about permaculture is there's this attitude that I'm gonna just say it flat out. One of the main issues about what makes this difficult for me is that I don't know why, for some reason, this is a contentious issue between me and my sister, because whenever I try to bring this up, she really gets upset about it. And I think that's because there's this idea of permaculture in the West Coast of being putting an emphasis on trying to get away from invasive species and encourage a return back to the native indigenous species, right? And there's this kind of you're doing this thing of the return to the original purity of the environment as it was beforehand. And then what I found was interesting about Gordon White was he was saying that that's not actually what permaculture is about, right? And that it's actually more interesting to be okay, so what if we're not in a pure environment? What if there are these foreign invasive species? And what if there's no going back to some original pure state? Okay, maybe you can take a plot of land and you can instead of planting foreign plants, you only plant in native indigenous species. You still just have a little plot of land that's surrounded by all this other stuff where people aren't doing that, right? And what if you started to be what if you accept the fact that there are invasive species that are here that aren't going away? And what happens if instead of being all about taking the thing that's judged to be a foreign hostile invader and purifying and expunging it and expelling it, instead of you start to be what's the relational dynamic between this thing that is foreign and doesn't belong and the thing that's native and indigenous? And how do you work in the situation to start to take the imbalance and balance it out a bit better? And and this isn't to say that you have to be there are plants which are weeds that you can pull out. It's not having. This is kind of funny where it's it has to be this total extreme of one thing or another. You have to be we either there's no weeds, all plants are okay, everything's we're not gonna judge between a dandelion and a plant that we want. We're gonna leave the dandelions in, but then there's also things that are you can very well choose that some plants are going to be ones that you pick out and some that are going to leave in, and that you can also be I'm going to grow things here that aren't indigenous. I don't have there's no fucking person who's going to the permaculture police aren't going to arrest me for not planting. This is what's really funny about it is there's this idea that we don't or this is the whole thing is that even people who are apparently going to be identify as being completely non-religious because you take religion to be this weird dominating puritanical force, that then you're going to be okay, I'm going to be I'm not going to be religious, but I'm going to be religious about only eating vegetables, or I'm going to be religious about we're going to make our garden a return to the Garden of Eden, and we're going to expel all of these these hostile corrupting influences, and it's just you've got, this is what's the whole point of there's even if you are completely secular, you've got a really religious, mystical unconscious that's all about transcending the limits of the world, the impurities and sinful, evil nature of the world, to go to this weird, abstract, transcendent thing that's completely disconnect. And it's there's also this thing about like, you know, even if you go, like the fact that the Buddhists were vegetarian, you know, the Buddhists were all this thing about like, you know, there's a spiritual lesson in valuing all animals and not, you know, not eating meat because that's violence towards animal. But then those Buddhists, like half the time they're drinking yak milk because they're in the Himalayas and they're surrounded by yaks, right? There's this thing that's like, if you are like, yeah, I was listening to this talk with Krishnamurti, and he said that he hung out with some Tibetan Buddhists in the Himalayas, and he was saying that they were very like, even though you know, you can imagine being up in the mountains, it could be very beautiful or very like there's something about but they have this attitude of like being like, if you are enjoying the sensual atmosphere of the natural environment, this is just this is almost like a sin or something. You're being selfish or something like that, right? But like there's this kind of thing you can imagine, like we use this image of verticality, of distancing yourself from the ground, the earth, and you're going higher and higher up to this remote peak in the clouds that's distant from all the worldly attachments and stuff like that. But even, you know, there's some kind of irony in the sense that even as you're doing this, your friends along the way are these yaks, these mountain goats, and that you end up being like, oh, we don't believe in killing animals, but, you know, we got these, like, if you just stay present with the situation that you're in, it's awfully convenient to use these yaks for dairy products. And like, they're just kind of, you know what I'm trying to say is that like it's like, I just feel like there's this weird thing that's not even reducible to some sort of extremist cult, but actually apparently normal everyday people who don't identify with this have this unconscious thing that I'm going to have these principles that are just so transcendently ungrounded that it's like, they're like, we're just going to eat nothing but like, you're going to make fake hamburgers that like look like meat, but they're not. And then like that are made in a lab and that are like completely separate from the actual real world that you exist, like, and have these morals that have absolutely nothing to do with your actual life. It's like some weird moral authority, and you're gonna have to like purity test everybody to that, and like everybody, and like then it turns into this thing where like I'm trying to like for me it becomes necessary to express my ideas on here, because to try to be like, you know, what if you did permaculture gardening, but you weren't such a weird Puritan about having it all have to be native? And it's like, what? It's like this, like they want, like I tried to talk to my, like, I'm trying to, and just also without, there's like, I don't know. It may be just like this weird, I don't really understand why it's so difficult just to like have an adult, intelligent conversation about these things. But it's like trying to even approach this is like there's some sort of underlying unconscious issue where it's like I just have to not talk about, like, there's all these things that I find really interesting and fascinating, but it's like by bringing it up, I'm risking, it's like, you know, I'm risking like going to war over it. I'm like, why are these ideas so threatening? Right? And it's like, and then this becomes this thing that's like, oh, you know, you are just, instead of you being a productive member of this is like, I can imagine this voice being like, I'll explain it to you. You could be a productive member of society that's well integrated in your community, but instead you choose to take this path where you like to read books, where you become more smarter, you become more intelligent than what's actually necessary for the situation, which gives you an air of cocky superiority. And then in your attempt to connect these ideas that you feel passionate about and enthusiastic about with your friends, that's interpreted, or your family members, that's interpreted as you just demonstrating your cocky superiority over them, and that your ability to reach that transcendent perfection that they're not able to, and then they just hate you for it. And then, you know, and it becomes this thing that rather than having a productive, talking about how we can work with our actual material situation, it becomes the source of hatred and creating fights and negative energy. And because you are just stubborn, what's your answer for this? Do you go and get a job? No, you just buy more books, read more, get more ideas, get more things that fill up your head that you cannot talk to people about, because they will just hate you, right? Because so you just become this kind of thing. You're like, oh well, okay, I guess I better just be like a like a monk who has his own private practice of reading things and then has a sort of wisdom, but then realizing I have to find some sort of very closed off, kind of maybe even elitist group of people who can talk about this, because most people like apparently really simple. Like I don't see it as being that things that I wouldn't consider being that controversial seem to provoke people into like some sort of murderous rage or something like that. I don't, because it's there's all these things that you're just supposed to like not take. You're not supposed to certain things you're not supposed to analyze, you're not supposed to critique, not supposed to question, and that the more you read about things, the more you do this, and then the more that you basically become schizophrenic, because you can't it's there's all these things you just can't talk about because of all this hostility, and it's just that is you're creating the demon of like intellectual superiority, right? And like I have sacrificed my own I could have had a happy life. I could have you could have had it all, man. You could have had a career, a wife, a child, a belonging in your community, but instead you decided to be a Marxist prick, right? That even the left wingers hate, because you just have to like focus, and so then you just have to accept that you have created unhealthy intellectual attachments, and you have to just sell off all your books, and you have to go into some sort of Zen meditation retreat where like some person is going to dictate to you what you're allowed to think, what you're not allowed to think, and you're not allowed to question anything, because by questioning things only gets you in trouble, basically, right? Like, I don't know. This is just an issue that I've been working on for a long time, and basically why I'm going to explain why I've gone in the direction that I have, as opposed to just, which is maybe, it has more to do with being nonconformist, more to do with questioning things, more to do with thinking things about myself. And to me, there's some value to doing this, even if it feels, I don't know. I also just have, maybe it's because I'm neurodivergent or something, but I just have this tendency to think differently from people. And then like that, the fact that I think differently, or I'm attracted to different ideas, or wanting to do things differently, just becomes it doesn't seem to make my life any easier, but I seem to be stubbornly, this is what I'm drawn to do, right? I don't know. Hopefully you understand. Hopefully I'm not wasting my breath by recording another video about this. I think this is enough for now. Thanks for watching.